We're talking with former Governor Reagan, and during the break we were discussing. When I mentioned that I thought most people were not apathetic, I think they're confused, basically, because you hear intelligent people from both political parties or in the middle, conservatives and liberals, and they all seem to have...
He was the king of late night, loved by millions, and known for his razor-sharp wit and effortless charm. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson carried a list, not of favorites, but of the few guests he quietly loathed. From comedians who crossed the line to stars who hijacked his stage, Carson kept the truth buried behind a smile until his final years. Whispers from close friends and former staff revealed the 7 names that tested his patience, broke his trust, and left lasting scars. These weren't just bad interviews, they were personal betrayals the public never saw. Until now, Bob Hope, the scripted legend Johnny couldn't stand. To the public, Bob Hope and Johnny Carson looked like comedic legends sharing a stage with mutual respect. But behind the velvet curtain, things were far less friendly. Johnny Carson, who valued spontaneity above all else, grew increasingly frustrated with Hope's mechanical approach to comedy. Hope didn't just arrive with a few notes. He brought entire scripts, often mailing producers pages of punchlines with setup questions already built in, weeks in advance. This rigid structure clashed hard with Carson's improv-driven rhythm. On one occasion, Carson tried to break free from the format, attempting to engage Hope organically. But the legendary comedian didn't budge. He stuck to his cue cards, ignoring every off-script moment. The result? Cold, lifeless, predictable. Carson, famous for his adaptability, began to resent being treated like a prop in Hope's well-rehearsed act. Behind the scenes, he started referring to himself bitterly as just the warm-up act for Texaco, a biting nod to Hope's corporate sponsorships that often made the show feel more like a sponsored skit than a true conversation. Though he never let it show on air, Carson was suffocating under Hope's old-school, control-heavy style. His disdain wasn't just personal, it was professional. Hope's comedy, once fresh, felt out of sync with the evolving nature of late-night television that Carson helped define. Still, because of Hope's celebrity power, he remained a recurring guest, despite Carson's deep discomfort. What millions of viewers saw as a warm reunion of legends was, for Carson, little more than a segment to survive. In the world of late-night TV, few guests tested Carson's patience like Bob Hope. He may have been a legend, but for Johnny, he was also the hardest to endure. Joan Rivers, the protege who broke his heart. Of all the guests to ever sit across from Johnny Carson, Joan Rivers was the one who cut the deepest. She wasn't just another comic. She was his protege, his hand-picked successor. Carson had given Rivers opportunities few ever received, including the coveted role of permanent guest host, a position that spoke volumes about his trust in her talent and character. But in 1986, everything changed. Without warning, Joan signed a deal to launch her own late-night show on Fox, a direct competitor to Johnny. Even worse, she didn't tell him herself. Carson heard it through the grapevine. For a man who kept his circle tight and personal, it felt like a devastating betrayal. He never spoke to her again. Producers said he blacklisted her name, handwriting permanently blacklisted on Tonight Show booking sheets. The rift became legendary in Hollywood circles. For Carson, it wasn't about competition, it was about loyalty. He had supported her, boosted her career, and trusted her. In return, he felt abandoned for a bigger paycheck and a brighter spotlight. Years later, Rivers admitted she regretted not telling him directly. But by then, it was too late. Carson was a man who forgave rarely and forgot never. Their fallout didn't just mark the end of a friendship. It marked the moment Carson realized that even those closest to him could turn. For a man who kept the mask of charm on for millions each night, this was the wound that never quite healed. Wayne Newton, the Vegas star who threatened Johnny. Johnny Carson often poked fun at celebrities. It was part of his charm. But Wayne Newton wasn't laughing. After repeated on-air jokes about Newton's looks, mannerisms, and flamboyant image, the singer stormed into Carson's office with a message. "Make me a joke again and I'll show you the punchline." Carson, usually composed, was visibly shaken. This wasn't a playful guest confrontation, it was a threat, face to face. From that day forward, producers were told to guarantee no Newton jokes before or after his performances, and any future appearances required delicate planning. What made it more shocking was Newton's status. He was beloved in Vegas, but not known for aggression. This incident showed Carson that his humor had limits, especially when it struck someone's public image too deeply. Behind the curtain, he lost his nerve around Newton, a rare thing for the king of late night. Carson's usual edge softened, at least where Newton was concerned. He never made jokes about him again. In private, Carson lamented the incident, not because he felt wrong, but because it reminded him that fame doesn't shield you from confrontation. And even behind the smile, the stage could become a battlefield. Fred Rogers, the kind guest who ruined the pacing. Fred Rogers, America's favorite gentle soul, seemed like the perfect Tonight Show guest. But for Johnny Carson, his appearance became a quiet disaster. Carson had hoped Mr. Rogers would bring warmth and nostalgia. Instead, he brought something worse for late-night TV. Stillness. His slow, thoughtful cadence, while heartwarming on PBS, clashed with the snappy, fast-paced rhythm of late night. Jokes fell flat. The audience grew restless. Viewers saw sweetness, but producers saw dipping ratings and awkward silences. Carson found himself in a no-win situation. He couldn't joke at Mr. Rogers' expense without looking cruel, but the segment dragged like molasses. Afterward, producers made a quiet decision: shorten the Rogers segments and air them only in December, when holiday sentiment made them more tolerable. Carson never spoke poorly of Fred Rogers. He respected the man. But he also knew that not every guest belonged in his world. Late night was about energy, timing, and laughter. Rogers, with his soft-spoken sincerity, slowed everything to a crawl. Behind the scenes, it was a lesson for Carson. Goodness doesn't always equal good television. Charlton Heston, the overtalker. When Charlton Heston appeared on The Tonight Show, he didn't just talk, he delivered monologues. The legendary actor approached interviews like he was teaching a university seminar, weaving in Greek philosophy, theatrical history, and Shakespearean quotes. What should have been a light, lively segment turned into a long-winded lecture. Carson's carefully timed comedy bits had to be cut just to make room. After one such appearance, Carson was so frustrated, he booked Don Rickles immediately after, telling producers, "We need someone to wake the audience back up." Heston wasn't rude, just out of touch with what made late night entertaining. Carson, always diplomatic on camera, later set strict time limits for future Heston interviews and demanded that pre-interview notes be tighter. The audience admired Heston's gravitas, but Carson saw the damage it did to the show's pacing. Behind the charm, he was a showman, not a professor. And Heston, while legendary, often forgot whose stage he was on. Though he never banned him, Carson made sure the long speeches didn't return, because in the world of late night, even giants have to learn when to pause. Don Rickles, the tornado of insults. To audiences, Don Rickles was a comedic storm, loud, brash, and brutally funny. To Johnny Carson, he was a double-edged sword. Rickles brought chaos to the show in a way that thrilled viewers, but quietly unsettled the host. Rickles wasn't just quick with insults, he was uncontrollable. During one legendary episode, while guest hosting for Carson, he broke Johnny's desk box, treating the set like a comedy playground. Carson, though smiling on the surface, wasn't amused. The segment went viral for its time, but behind the scenes, it sparked tension. On-air confrontations between Carson and Rickles made for great TV. The audience laughed. Producers leaned in. But Johnny? He didn't like being overshadowed. Rickles had a way of hijacking segments, ignoring timing cues, and pushing jokes beyond what NBC could safely air. There were nights producers had to work overtime editing Rickles' jokes for broadcast. Too fast, too wild, too risky. Carson eventually limited Rickles to just one appearance a year, joking to staff, "Rickles is a hurricane, one storm at a time." Despite the restriction, their relationship was oddly warm. Carson respected Rickles' brilliance, but he also recognized the cost of too much Rickles energy. The show needed rhythm, and Rickles brought chaos. He was both the best and worst kind of guest, the one you couldn't control and couldn't ignore. That's why, even in Carson's later years, the name Rickles still brought a grin and a wince. He loved him, but in small, heavily managed doses. Chevy Chase, the arrogant rising star. Chevy Chase walked onto Johnny Carson's stage with swagger and left with a black mark he never fully escaped. At the time, Chase was riding high on his Saturday Night Live fame, but Carson didn't care about trendiness. He cared about respect. And from the moment Chase opened his mouth, Carson knew something was off. Chevy treated his first appearance like a private audition, not a conversation. He mocked Johnny's mannerisms, interrupted questions, and even mimicked Carson's golf swing in front of the live audience. The crowd laughed nervously. Carson didn't. That night, Carson's patience wore thin. He gave Chase the spotlight, but never forgot the arrogance. Behind the scenes, staff immediately noticed the fallout. Carson demoted Chase's future appearances to second segment only, a subtle but telling move that signaled Johnny's disapproval. Worse, the Tonight Show team quietly implemented new rules just for Chase. No chair spinning, no Carson impersonations, and no jokes at Johnny's expense. Carson wasn't easily offended, but he didn't tolerate being mocked in his own house. Chevy, whether he realized it or not, crossed that line. In later interviews, Carson never mentioned Chase directly, but among insiders it was well known. Chevy got one shot. He blew it. For a man who built a career on timing, Chevy's misstep was a moment Carson never wanted to repeat. Uri Geller, the pseudo-psychic who got exposed. Few guests rattled Johnny Carson like Uri Geller, but not because Geller was loud or rude. It was because Carson saw him as something worse, a fraud. Geller had risen to fame claiming he could bend spoons with his mind, a power he often demonstrated on live TV. But Carson, a trained magician himself, saw right through it. Rather than mock Geller openly, Carson did something far more calculated. He called in James Randi, a fellow skeptic and illusionist, and together they prepared a trap. Geller would be presented with a set of spoons and props he hadn't touched or prepared, ensuring no trickery could be used. The night of the appearance, Geller squirmed. He claimed to feel off, said the vibes weren't right, and ultimately failed to perform. The segment aired live, millions watched, and Geller's reputation took a hit he never fully recovered from. Geller later claimed he had been ambushed, but Carson didn't apologize. To him, the duty was clear. Truth matters, especially on live TV. The incident became one of Carson's most famous and most satisfying takedowns. He never raised his voice, never insulted Geller. He simply exposed him with logic, precision, and a little backstage magic. It was a reminder that Carson's show wasn't just for laughs. It was also for integrity. And if you walked in with a lie, you risked walking out in pieces. Elizabeth Taylor, the diva who turned the show into an ad. Johnny Carson knew what a guest like Elizabeth Taylor meant for ratings. She was a Hollywood icon, a walking headline, and one of the most recognizable women in the world. But when she finally agreed to appear on The Tonight Show, Carson quickly realized it wasn't going to be the glamorous TV moment he had hoped for. It was going to be a carefully managed, tightly controlled performance. Taylor arrived with a long list of demands. The lighting had to be just right. The topics had to be pre-approved, with one very firm line drawn: no questions about Richard Burton. Carson, who preferred to steer interviews with instinct and wit, was boxed in. What was meant to be an open conversation turned into a scripted commercial. Worse, Taylor used the segment to promote her new perfume line, barely engaging in the usual banter Carson was known for. At one point, visibly frustrated, Johnny leaned over and quipped, "Is there a bottle under your chair?" Taylor, unsmiling, stared back. That moment said everything. Carson was furious afterward. Not because Taylor was difficult, he'd dealt with far tougher personalities, but because the interview lacked authenticity. It wasn't entertainment. It was an ad wrapped in glamour. The show had been hijacked for self-promotion, and that crossed a line for Johnny. She was never invited back. Quietly, her name was marked as a one-time guest. Behind the curtain, Carson vented to staff that the night wasn't just awkward. It was a reminder that not all stars shine the same way on live TV. Frank Sinatra, the king who hijacked the stage. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a celebrity. He was a force of nature. And when he walked into Carson's studio, everything changed. But for Johnny, the cost of hosting the chairman of the board was higher than most knew. Their most infamous moment came in 1976, when Sinatra interrupted Carson mid-joke and took over the stage. It wasn't hostile, just pure ego. Sinatra knew the cameras would follow him anywhere. Carson, ever the professional, smiled and let him have it. But behind the scenes, he was livid. Hosting Frank came with baggage. His entourage demanded VIP treatment, security bullied staff, and every minor detail, from the green room temperature to the coffee blend, was micromanaged. Carson felt like a guest on his own show. He later told a close friend, "It's Frank's world. We just make TV in it." Carson was used to adjusting for stars, but Sinatra was different. Too big to challenge, too demanding to enjoy. And though the episode became one of the most rewatched segments in Tonight Show history, Johnny never truly forgave it. After that, Sinatra's appearances were kept brief and rare. Carson knew the ratings would spike, but he also knew the cost to his own sanity. Hosting Frank may have pleased NBC, but it chipped away at Johnny's control, and that was something he didn't give up easily. British comedians, the toilet humor he loathed. While Johnny Carson admired many forms of comedy, there was one brand he never learned to enjoy: British toilet humor. When producers began booking UK comedians in the 80s to appeal to a broader international audience, Carson felt increasingly alienated by their style. He once quipped off-camera, "They're obsessed with toilets. It's like Monty Python meets a urinal." To Carson, the humor felt juvenile and crude, lacking the sharp wit and subtle timing he respected in American acts like George Carlin or Steve Martin. What might earn a laugh at a pub, Carson believed, didn't belong on his stage. But the network pushed forward. Ratings were a priority, and British comics brought curiosity and international buzz. Carson, always the professional, played along. On camera, he smiled and nodded, but backstage, he clenched his jaw, quietly asking producers, "Please, no more flatulence jokes." The cultural divide was more than comedic. It was personal. Carson's style was precise, polished, and built on timing. He had spent decades building The Tonight Show into a beacon of American class and cleverness. Hosting a comic who made 5 jokes about bathroom stalls in 7 minutes? It wasn't just unfunny. It was an insult to the legacy Johnny had worked so hard to build. Though he never banned all British comics, Carson made his preferences known. The laughter you heard during those interviews? Polite, controlled, and far from genuine. Because for Johnny, toilet humor didn't just stink. It stained the stage. Raymond Burr, the one who took things too personally. When Raymond Burr, the brooding, respected star of Perry Mason and Ironside, first appeared on The Tonight Show, expectations were high. Carson was a fan of Burr's work. The moment was billed as a meeting between two icons, a relaxed conversation between a sharp-witted host and a Hollywood heavyweight. But what unfolded instead was a quiet disaster. Not explosive, but deeply uncomfortable. Carson's brand of humor always walked a fine line. He was never mean-spirited, but he believed in light teasing as an art form, a way to break the ice, to connect. During Burr's segment, Johnny dropped a quick, seemingly harmless quip about Burr's weight, slipping it in between anecdotes as he'd done with hundreds of guests before. But this time, it didn't land. Burr didn't laugh, he didn't smile. He froze. The tension was immediate. For the audience at home, the shift might have been subtle, but those in the studio felt it. The room went still. Burr kept his composure on camera, answering questions with clipped politeness, but the warmth vanished instantly. The chemistry Carson relied on evaporated in seconds. After the taping, it got worse. Burr reportedly called the producers not just to complain, but to express genuine hurt. He said he felt blindsided and humiliated that the show had used him for cheap laughs. Carson, who had lovingly ribbed everyone from Frank Sinatra to Betty White, was shocked. He didn't mean it as cruelty. For Carson, these moments were part of what made The Tonight Show so human. He believed teasing was a bridge, not a dagger, but Burr clearly didn't see it that way. From that moment on, Raymond Burr was never invited back, and more tellingly, his name was quietly placed on Carson's private "do not book" list, not out of malice, but from a sense of self-protection. Johnny didn't want a repeat of that tension. He respected Burr, but the trust had been broken. Insiders later said Carson wasn't angry. He was deeply disappointed. Burr's reaction shook him more than he admitted. It was a reminder that not everyone came to play, that not every guest was ready to laugh at themselves. For a man who made his living off chemistry, timing, and shared chuckles, that silence stung more than any verbal jab ever could. In the end, Burr became a kind of cautionary tale, not because he overreacted, but because his reaction exposed the fragile line Carson walked every night. One misplaced joke, one misunderstood smile, and the whole illusion could collapse. And for Carson, there was no worse feeling than killing a laugh that was never born. Final reflection: why Carson kept it quiet until the end. As The Tonight Show neared its legendary curtain call in May of 1992, Johnny Carson did what no one in television expected. He left with graceful silence. No tell-all memoir, no revenge tour, no burning of bridges. He stepped away as mysteriously as he held the spotlight for 3 decades. To millions, Carson simply faded out on a warm note. But those in his inner circle, his writers, longtime producers, and closest friends, knew the real weight behind his departure. In his final years on the show, Carson had begun to reflect. And not just on his successes. He thought deeply about the people who challenged him, who tested his patience, and, perhaps most painfully, who betrayed his trust. There were the protégés who blindsided him, the A-listers who walked on stage as if they owned it, and the ungrateful guests who saw The Tonight Show as a stepping stone, not the sacred platform Carson had built it to be. He rarely named names publicly. That wasn't Johnny's style. For him, preserving the illusion of effortless late-night joy mattered far more than voicing his own personal grudges. But behind closed doors, the truth lived. One longtime staffer recalled, he remembered every slight. He just didn't air it. He believed the audience deserved a clean show, even if he left the stage with a bitter taste. To Carson, comedy wasn't just jokes. It was ritual, respect, and connection. It was a space where America could put its feet up, forget its troubles, and laugh without venom. When a guest broke that rhythm, by being selfish, arrogant, or manipulative, Carson felt it deeply. As the years wore on, Carson grew increasingly disillusioned with the evolution of the industry. He spoke privately about how fame was changing people, how self-promotion was replacing genuine conversation, and how the camera had turned into a mirror for egos. In many ways, he knew it was time to go. The stage was changing, and the kind of show he ran, the kind built on trust, timing, and 2 chairs, was beginning to feel like a relic of a classier time. And yet, he never named the worst offenders. He didn't write the scandalous chapter. He let the myth of late-night magic remain intact. That silence, in itself, was his final act of showmanship. But whispers remained, and through them, a truth became clear. Johnny Carson didn't just host a talk show, he protected a sacred space, a nightly tradition, a national heartbeat. And in the end, not everyone deserved to be part of it. Carson may have smiled on air, but behind the curtain, he never forgot those who crossed him. His silence was professional, but his memory was sharp. In the end, it wasn't just about laughter. It was about respect. And for these 7 guests, they never earned their way back.